Stop! Authorized maintenance personnel only. The words landed cold and final, as if the person standing there were not a human being, but an obstacle to be removed. Elena Cross stopped just short of the F-35 Lightning, motionless on the runway. She stood there without explanation, without rushing to respond. In her hand was an old tool bag, faded and heavy, something that did not fit their idea of who was authorized. Step back. Ma'am, authorized maintenance only. The young airman's eyes flicked from the bag to her face, then lingered there suspicious. A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. Family Day was last month, he said. I can't let you cross this line. A quiet laugh came from behind him, short, sharp. What's this? Your husband's toolbox? The laughter wasn't loud, but it was enough to erase everything Elena Cross had ever been. Enough to turn someone who had given her entire life to the mission into someone who suddenly didn't belong. Elena didn't answer. She didn't mention her rank. She didn't explain why she was there. She simply stood in the brutal heat under dismissive eyes before an aircraft waiting to be saved, surrounded by people who didn't yet know that in just a few minutes they would have to relearn what competence, honor, and respect truly mean. If you believe there are women who carried responsibility in silence, subscribe to Veterans Legacy Stories, so together we can preserve memory, dignity, and reverence for our quiet female heroes. Elena Cross didn't argue back. She didn't offer long explanations, didn't try to persuade, didn't show offense. She remained exactly where the order had forced her to stop, as if this kind of silence had been familiar to her for a very long time. Her hand tightened around the strap of the tool bag. Not out of anger, not out of fear, but out of habit, the reflex of someone who had learned to protect what she carried, not just tools, but an entire life. Elena's gaze was calm, not evasive, not defiant. She simply looked straight ahead long enough for the person facing her to realize he was being looked back at, not with weakness, but with a self-command forged over years. She took a very light breath. Then she spoke slowly, evenly, without emphasis. I am authorized. Just 4 words. Nothing more. No explanation. No appeal to rank assignment or past service. The sentence wasn't meant to argue. It was simply a fact, set down plainly, and bare the way she worked with machines, right or wrong, yes or no, authorized or not, with no gray space in between. The silence that followed stretched longer than usual. No one answered immediately. No one confirmed. No one stepped aside to let her pass. That empty space made the air grow heavy. Because Elena's silence was not retreat. It was waiting steady, patient, the kind of restraint that people accustomed to giving orders often cannot tolerate. The young airman began to grow uncomfortable, not because she had said something wrong, but because she hadn't reacted the way he expected. She didn't plead. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't appear confused or frightened. Elena stood there the same way she had stood beside disabled aircraft in the middle of the desert when everyone around her had lost their composure. The same way she had stood beside pilots waiting for life or death answers when time itself refused to be on their side. That calm was not accidental. It came from sleepless nights, from shifts that stretched beyond 24 hours, from being overlooked again and again because of her appearance, her voice, or simply because she was a woman in a space long dominated by men. Elena didn't need to prove anything in that moment. She knew her value did not depend on being believed immediately. That value lay in the fact that when the noise finally died down, there was still someone capable of bringing something presumed dead back to life. The young airman looked at her again, this time longer. Not to judge, but to search for a sign of hesitation, the kind he was used to seeing in people under pressure. There was none. Elena's eyes were unchanged. Her hand still gripped the strap. Her stance remained solid. That unchanging presence made the situation uncomfortable. Because when power fails to bend someone, people often resort to hurting them with words. And that was when the silence, once the shield protecting Elena's dignity, began to be tested by laughter, by half-jokes, by casual remarks she had grown accustomed to throughout her career. And from that discomfort, the next act of contempt began to take shape, no longer an order, but public humiliation, pushing the story into a new threshold altogether. Elena's silence didn't calm the situation. It made the people standing across from her more uncomfortable. A young airman stepped half a pace forward, his eyes flicking down to the tool bag in her hand. The corner of his mouth curled upward, his voice stretching out, half joking, half dismissive. Nice toolbox. That thing. Your husband's. The comment wasn't loud, but it was loud enough for those nearby to hear. Loud enough for a few heads to turn. loud enough to turn a private moment into a public stage of humiliation. Another airman chuckled softly and added as if just for fun, probably brought it along for show. This isn't a place to fix household appliances. The laughter spread. Not noisy, but evenly dispersed, like tiny needles all pressing into the same point. Elena glanced at the bag for a single brief second. Then she looked up. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply shifted her tone from silence to professionalism. This F-35 is experiencing repeated CAN bus faults, she said, clear and precise. Intermittent ghost codes. They're causing the integrated fire control system to lock itself into safety. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was information. It was fact. She continued without being prompted. The source is most likely in the EOTS bay. The wiring harness is cinched incorrectly. When the temperature rises, the frame expands and causes intermittent shorts. The terminology dropped into the space between them. CAN bus, ghost code, EOTS, integrated fire control. To Elena, this was everyday language. To the two young airmen, it was something they had never been prepared to understand. Their eyes began to empty. Not because she was wrong, but because they didn't understand, and that lack of understanding quickly turned into defensiveness. Those words sound familiar, one of them cut in. But honestly, it sounds like nonsense. The other laughed, emboldened by having an audience. You're trying to scare us with jargon. Everyone here works on F-35s. By now, the crowd was clearly paying attention. Some people stopped what they were doing. Others stood still to listen. No one intervened. The humiliation grew not because of the words themselves, but because of the silent agreement surrounding them. Elena didn't change her tone. She didn't belittle them. She didn't elevate herself. This aircraft has been grounded for 2 weeks, she continued. All other systems are nominal. There's only one unstable fault, and it appears when the temperature increases. She paused at exactly the right moment, waiting for a question, waiting for a sign of listening. There was none. Instead, another laugh broke out. Sounds like you're reading straight from a manual. Where did you learn all this anyway? The question wasn't asked to understand. It was thrown to diminish. Elena looked directly at the one who had spoken. She answered briefly, plainly. On the job. Nothing more. That restraint only made the tension worse. Because when people can't pull someone down with words, they often resort to smearing them with attitude. One of the airmen glanced at the bag again. So what's in there? A wrench or souvenirs? The laughter burst out again, louder now, more confident. Because at this point, Elena was no longer just someone being blocked. She had become a joke. Elena didn't respond, not because she had nothing left to say, but because she understood that any explanation now would only prolong the humiliation. She tightened her grip on the strap of the bag, not as a defensive reflex, but as a final boundary. She had been in places where a small mistake could cost lives. She had explained things to people willing to listen. But here, listening did not exist. The eyes around her continued to close in. The crowd's silence was no longer neutral. It became pressure, and under that pressure, the next words were no longer orders, but open, direct humiliation, with no attempt to hide it. And in that moment, when one gaze lingered just a little too long on the worn bag and the patch sewn onto it, another layer of meaning quietly opened the place where memory began to speak. One gaze in the crowd lingered too long on the bag in Elena's hand. Not on how worn it was, not on its shape, but on a frayed patch carefully stitched onto the side of the bag. A hand pointed toward it. What's that? The voice wasn't loud, but it carried far enough for everyone to hear. A souvenir patch. The question was tossed lightly, like harmless teasing. But for Elena, it touched something far deeper somewhere that was no longer the present. She didn't answer right away, not because she hadn't heard, but because in a single breath memory surged forward. No runway, no laughter, only sand. Sand covering everything. Sand filling the lungs. Sand scraping the skin. A makeshift hangar in the middle of the desert. Wind strong enough to make metal shudder in short, violent bursts. Inside an aircraft that was no longer cleared to fly. Warning lights flashing. A primary control system refusing to initialize. Time stretched tight like a steel cable. A young pilot stood a few steps away from Elena. His face had gone pale. Not because he feared death, but because he knew that if that aircraft didn't take off, the people waiting for support on the ground would not come home. No one dared to commit. No one wanted to sign off. Except Elena. She climbed into the avionics bay, a flashlight clenched between her teeth, bare hands tracing each wiring bundle. No complete schematics, no time for trial and error, only instinct and responsibility. She found the fault. A microscopic abrasion on a wire, too small to trigger a clear system alert, but just enough to make the aircraft betray the one flying it. She fixed it. The pilot took off. Hours later, when the aircraft returned intact, the pilot walked straight up to Elena. No long speech, no embrace. He simply removed the patch from his own shoulder and placed it in her hand. You saved them. That was all. The patch wasn't issued. It wasn't in any regulation. It had no serial number. It was given hand to hand between people who understood that some victories are never written into reports. The memory dissolved. Elena returned to the present. She looked down at the patch. The threads were worn. The fabric had faded with time, but the stitching remained intact like a reminder that refused to disappear. She looked up. Not a souvenir, Elena said, her voice low and steady. Just one sentence. She didn't explain further. She didn't tell the story. She didn't mention the desert. She didn't mention the pilot. Because some memories don't need to be believed. They only need to be respected. Silence spread. Not because everyone understood, but because Elena's presence had shifted the space around her. The patch was no longer a joke. It became an unanswered question. A sign that the woman standing before them had been to places where laughter did not exist. A few eyes began to turn away. A few people stood a little straighter. No one laughed anymore. Elena rested her hand on the strap of the bag, more lightly than before. As if the patch had just reminded her why she continued this work, not to be recognized, but to remember. The air grew heavy, but the tension was not over. Because when a sacred symbol is brought into the light, the next reaction is rarely reverence, it is often the final resistance of egos that feel threatened. And in that moment, the next words began to move beyond joking, crossing into the territory of direct challenge. Elena Cross no longer looked down at the patch. She had looked long enough. She raised her head, her gaze steady, so calm it made the person facing her hesitate for half a beat. It's a reminder, she said. The mission comes first. Her voice wasn't loud. It wasn't sharp, but it was solid as steel. Not an excuse, not a defense. A principle. In that moment, the noise around them seemed to fall away. No one laughed anymore. No one joked. Because her words weren't aimed at them, they passed straight through them. The young airman tightened his grip on the badge in his hand. He didn't fully grasp the meaning of what she'd said, but he felt that he had just come up against something that couldn't be handled with the tone he was used to. You don't have authorization to be here, he replied, forcing firmness into his voice. We're following procedure. Elena didn't argue. She answered calmly, deliberately. Procedure exists to protect the mission. A brief silence followed. Not because the statement was complex, but because it forced an uncomfortable question into the open. What are you protecting, procedure or its purpose? The other airman stepped forward quicker now, more agitated. All right, he said. That's enough. He turned halfway away as if trying to reclaim control. We're calling this up the chain. You'll remain where you are. Elena nodded. Not reluctantly, not defiantly. Go ahead, she said. Follow procedure. It wasn't indifference. It was readiness, the kind that only comes from someone unafraid of being examined. The young airman took a few steps, then stopped. He turned back, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. Something in Elena's composure wouldn't let him simply walk away. While we verify, he said, his tone shifting, I'm instructing you to set the bag down. Elena didn't look at the bag. She looked straight at him. No. One word. No explanation. No emotion attached. The airman frowned. You're interfering with operations. Elena shook her head slightly. This bag is part of the mission. The tension sharpened instantly. No more joking. No middle ground of misunderstanding. The airman drew in a deep breath. Authority was in his hands. Certainty was not. If you continue to refuse, he said, I'll consider this failure to comply with a lawful order. Elena didn't change her stance. She didn't step forward. She didn't step back. If you believe that's the right course of action, she replied, then do it. No provocation, no anger, only an absolute trust. The truth does not need fear to defend it. That was when things began to slip out of control. Because when someone refuses to yield, immature authority often chooses escalation. I'm initiating temporary detention, the airman said. The word detention fell heavily. No longer procedure, no longer misunderstanding. A line had been crossed. Elena remained still. Her hand stayed firm on the strap of the bag, not to resist, but to protect what she carried, the thing that had followed her through places where mistakes meant loss. The airman pulled out his radio. His words came fast, tight, tense. Elena didn't need to hear the call. She knew this moment well, the moment when words no longer mattered, only who would arrive next. And when the transmission ended, when the airman looked up with eyes caught between stubbornness and worry, Elena understood that the story had already left the hands of those standing in front of her. Because from that moment on, the truth was on its way, and it didn't need anyone's permission. As soon as the call ended, a familiar voice, one that carried authority, spoke from behind them. Low, decisive. It didn't need to be loud. Report the situation. The young airman turned, hesitated for a fraction of a second, then snapped to attention by reflex. The atmosphere shifted instantly. No one laughed. No one interrupted. The commander stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the scene before stopping on Elena Cross. One glance was enough. He straightened, raised his hand in a formal salute. Technical Sergeant Cross. The greeting was clear, precise, without a wasted word. Not a courtesy. A recognition. Silence settled over the group. Moments earlier, faces had been filled with doubt. Now they froze, unable to hide their unease. The commander turned to the two young airmen. Do you have any idea who you're speaking to? No one answered. He looked back at Elena, his tone softening slightly while the gravity remained. Technical Sergeant, I apologize for the delay. Elena returned it with a brief nod. No relief, no sense of victory. The commander turned again, his voice carrying clearly enough for everyone to hear. This is Technical Sergeant Elena Cross, he said. The individual personally requested to come here and resolve the fault on this F-35. A pause. Just long enough for the name to sink in. The aircraft the entire maintenance team has been unable to fix for 2 weeks. The aircraft that, if not resolved today, would stall the entire mission. No one moved. No one spoke. The commander continued, not raising his voice, not dramatizing, only stating facts. She is the one who identified a system fault that passed through every standard diagnostic check. A fault even the manufacturer's senior engineering support could not pinpoint. A few people began to understand. Not who Elena was, but the magnitude of their own mistake. There was a formal letter of recognition from a senior engineer, the commander went on, confirming that her solution has been implemented across the fleet. There was no pride in his tone, only report. Elena remained still. She didn't correct. She didn't add. The commander turned back to the two young airmen, his voice dropping, leaving no room for argument. And while we were waiting for her to save this F-35, you stopped her. You threatened detention. No one argued. No one met his eyes. The commander didn't raise his voice. There was no need. The truth carried enough weight on its own. He turned back to Elena. The aircraft is yours, Technical Sergeant. One sentence. Enough to reverse the balance of power in the space completely. Elena looked toward the F-35, then back at the people who had just blocked her path. She didn't reproach them. She didn't revisit what had just happened. She spoke evenly, clearly. The aircraft doesn't care who's holding the wrench. It only cares whether that person knows what they're doing. No one responded. Elena stepped forward unhurried without waiting for anyone to clear the way. No one stopped her. The commander stepped aside, yielding space in proper form. Not because of rank, but because of capability. The eyes around them had changed now. No more doubt. Only a silence carrying a lesson that needed no explanation. And when authority finally returned to where it belonged, the story was no longer about right or wrong, but about how people face the truth once they've truly seen it. The two young airmen stood frozen. No more laughter. No more glancing around for approval. Only shame written plainly across their faces, late in coming, but unavoidable. They had just heard her name. They had just understood why every eye had shifted. And they had just realized they had been standing in the wrong place from the very beginning. Elena Cross looked at them. Not harshly. Not coldly. just long enough for them to understand that the most painful thing was not being reprimanded, it was being seen for who they truly were in their worst moment. She spoke before anyone else could. The jet doesn't care who holds the wrench. Her voice was even, not instructive, not accusatory. It only cares that you know how to use it. The words settled into the heavy silence, not like a judgment, but like a law of nature. The two airmen lowered their heads. No one told them to. No one ordered it. One of them finally spoke, his voice rough with tension. "Sir, I'm sorry." Short. No excuses. Elena didn't respond immediately. She looked toward the aircraft, then back at them. "An apology doesn't fix the jet," she said. "The work does." She didn't need them to feel more shame. She didn't need a public confession. She only needed them to return to where they belonged. "Get me the ladder," Elena continued, "and recheck the EOTS bay." No one objected. No one hesitated. The two airmen moved at once. No awkwardness. No ego. They worked in silence, a different kind of silence than before. Not the silence of contempt, but the silence of learning. Elena began her work. No reminders were needed. No one stood watching her with measuring eyes. The people around them dispersed, returning to their own tasks. No whispers. No praise. Only the steady rhythm of work, the language Elena had always believed to be the most honest. One of the two airmen glanced at Elena just briefly. Not to judge, but to remember. Not her name, but the way she had handled everything. She hadn't used power to teach them a lesson. She had used standards. No one was further humiliated. No one was crushed. But everyone understood there were boundaries that should never be crossed, not out of fear of rank, but out of respect for the profession. Elena didn't bring up what had happened again. She didn't hold it as a debt. To her, the past only mattered if it helped the present work better. She worked with absolute focus. No excess emotion. No searching for recognition. The two young airmen watched. They didn't speak to each other, but they understood that today they had learned something no manual could fully capture. That in the military, authority does not come from ordering others around. It comes from whether you can be trusted when things truly matter. And that some people don't need to speak much to be heard, because the way they work speaks for them. Elena finished the first check. She looked up at the two airmen. "Keep going," she said. "We don't have much time." No forgiveness was declared, but no resentment remained. Only work continuing and dignity restored to its rightful place. And in the quiet rhythm of hands returning to work, the true legacy of Elena Cross slowly came into view, not in the aircraft about to be saved, but in the people who were changing one small measure at a time. Elena Cross returned to her work, as if there were nothing that needed to be revisited. She opened her tool bag, selected exactly what she needed, moved straight to the area that required inspection. No long explanations, no ceremony. Only precise, familiar motions repeated thousands of times over the course of her career. Only a few minutes passed. Not because of any miracle, but because experience knows where to look. A section of wiring cinched too tightly. A spot where as temperatures rose, the metal expanded just enough to cause intermittent shorts. A minor physical misalignment, yet enough to create a technical nightmare. Elena adjusted it, secured it properly, ran a final check. The readings stabilized. The warnings disappeared. Not long after the F-35 was released from the ground. No commentary required. No declaration of victory. It took off the way it was meant to, on time, on mission to standard. No one applauded. No one cheered. Because those who understood knew this, what mattered wasn't the moment the aircraft left the runway, but the fact that it didn't fall out of the sky afterward. In the days that followed, the base issued a small but official change. A single line added to procedure. Brief, clear, verify before judge. Verify before you judge. Elena's name wasn't mentioned. The incident wasn't referenced. But everyone understood why that line existed. A few weeks passed. Elena prepared to leave the way she had arrived, quietly. No formal goodbye. No speech. One calm evening when the workday had eased, a young airman approached her. No arrogance left. No defensive tone. He stood straight. Stopped at the proper distance. "Technical Sergeant," he said. "I want to apologize. No circling. No excuses. Just words spoken because they needed to be spoken." Elena looked at him, not probing, not judging. At the time, I didn't know he continued, his voice lower. But now I do. Elena nodded slightly. You didn't know, she replied. Now you do. That's enough. No lecture. No declaration of forgiveness. Just an acceptance that a lesson had been learned and didn't need to be carved deeper with shame. The young airman lowered his head. Not because of rank, but because of understanding. He turned and walked away slower than when he had arrived. Not out of fear, but because he was thinking. Elena didn't watch him for long. She returned to what was familiar. The tool bag. The work. A rhythm that didn't require an audience. Her story wasn't passed along as a loud legend. It became a quiet reminder in how people treated one another. They didn't just remember her name. They remembered how they treated the next woman. And that was the true legacy. Legacy isn't rank that makes others bow. Legacy is how we teach those who come after us to respect the right person at the right moment. Elena Cross didn't need to be called a hero. She only needed the world to work a little better after she left it. Veterans' legacy stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story leads you to see a woman with deeper respect, subscribe to Veterans' legacy stories so that female veterans are never forgotten.